The seventh continent, plastic icebergs, gorged valleys of mining tailings, fatbergs, toxic fogs, nuclear zones where wild pigs have decided it's safer to be than outside in the human-infested suburbs, exurbs, urbs that have left no place for anything but ravenous consumption of capitalist humans. Supposedly, this poisonous new topology of capitalism's earth have spawned 4 axioms of existence in an increasingly large area of critical theory. So what I want to do is just actually walk through these 4 axioms, none of which hopefully will be surprising to you, new to you, or anything. You just go, that's what I want, right? And ultimately, what I want to do is think critically about what's at stake between beginning with the biosphere or the colonial sphere. Voila, okay. So let me start with these 4 axioms. And I think these 4 axioms are, already today we've heard them, or at least we've heard a couple. And I do think there are increasingly the presuppositions of an ever larger zone of critical theory, but at least 2 of them also an ever larger zone of the natural sciences. So the 4 axioms are the entanglement of existence, or existence is entangled, right? Yeah, good. Yep. 2, the differential powers to intervene and change how this entanglement is entangled, depending on where you are in it, right? So depending on how you're entangled, you have different powers to affect the whole thing, right? Yep, okay. This one, some people say, oh, wait a minute, that's not, really, is this an axiom now? But I think it increasingly is. So 3rd, the multiplicity and collapse of the political event. And by that I mean, it used to be in the Western revolutionary political theory, it was you see revolution, boom, the big event. What was the event? Right? And now, of course, we know that there are quasi-events, there's small events, there's massive death, and so there's a multiplicity of the form of the event, but there's also the collapse of the event, i.e., intensities without eventfulness, right? So we know that. Okay, good. The fourth axiom is that not only are European Enlightenment concepts, not only have they been provincialized, right? So they're European, they're not truth. They're potentially dangerous and toxic. So not only the provincialization of European epistemologies and ontologies, but their danger in view of climate collapse, quote, the Anthropocene, et cetera. Okay, so none of those should be surprising, right? 4 axioms, we all know them, good. So let me briefly describe each and then suggest what's at stake, depending on if we think about these as 1, 2, 3, 4, or 4, 3, 2, 1. That is, if we think about them from the concept of the biosphere rather than the concept of the colonial sphere, and then end by talking about what's at stake in at least the Cotabing artistic practices. So axiom number 1, remember, existence is entangled. Sometimes I say the extimacy of existence, pulling from Lacan's notion of the extimate. But let's just say entangled. We've already heard it this morning. We know the drill, right? Things are not, there's not this and that, and they're tied together, rather that the condition of existence of this thing is through and in other things. Voila, yeah? Good. Now, what's interesting, and this is where I really want to have a conversation, is that some of our most respected theorists ground this claim about the entanglement of existence in the epistemologies or the savoirs of science and biology, especially physics, right? So we have Karen Barad, who, of course, in quantum theory, we have Donna Haraway, well, Barad and Stengers in, I would say, physics and quantum theory. We have Haraway in biology, so what was radical notions of biological evolution, and also prior to that, we had Bateson, who's talking about the biosphere, that is, the mind in which we are a part. And we also have Guattari, who talks about ecosophy. So we have, leaving aside Guattari for a minute, we have a whole host of our most precious theorists all grounding the first axiom in Western epistemologies and ontologies, and the ontologies that lie underneath it, especially the ontology of the bios and the zoe that has always excluded the geos. Okay, I'll come back to that. Axiom 2, which I said, that is, depending on where you are in this entanglement, you have, which is, of course, depending on where you are in this entanglement, you have different powers to affect both how you're entangled and the entanglement writ more large. So that is, axiom 2 says that it's not that it's entangled, but that it's an entanglement of power and force. And what's at stake here is that entanglement of power and force, especially if we're thinking in relation to this Biennale, is that entanglement also has to do with where all these toxins, these fatbergs, these plastics end up. So you go to certain beaches, and the beaches are just, you've been to beaches, and they're nothing but plastic bottles, right? Or you're Navajo, and your land is a nuclear dump. Thus, the sites of refusal of how existence is entangled are often coming from the places that receive the toxic waste, receive the seventh continent of capitalist consumption. Okay, axiom 3, the multiplicity and collapse of the event flows from the second, supposedly, insofar as we understand now in political theory, especially those coming out of the West, supposedly, that power, that this entanglement is not kept in place, that is the power to keep existence entangled in a particular way, which it has to do with the flow of forces and who is the receiving end of these toxins and who's the delivery end, isn't merely kept in place by big events like, military, that hard force, but by all the small little events. Like you just, if you're at the receiving end of toxicity, it's just that the physical and mental effort that goes into not being swallowed by that sea of the seventh continent. And it also has to do with staying in place when your whole life is, which is never an event. Okay, so that's axiom 3. Okay, now, remember, we started with axiom 1. We've grounded in physics and biology, by and large, in critical theory. We've gone to axiom 2, which talks about that the differential powers to affect depending on this flow of forces, depending on how you're entangled in it. And then we get to 3, in which it's that, depending on how you're entangled in it, your effort might not be seen in the big event, but in all these little quasi-events or just intensity without eventfulness. And then we get to 4, axiom 4, which, remember, we just nod our head at, in which we say, well, not merely have we seen the provincialization of European Enlightenment epistemologies and ontologies, but we've claimed that they're actually were part and parcel of a form of danger to the planet. And then you have to give pause, at least I have to give pause, and I have to at least ask, how the hell do we reconcile axiom 4 with axiom 1? How can we say axiom 1, in which we're regrounding our insights in the very epistemologies and ontologies that we have claimed are now provincial and potentially dangerous? Now, there's a bunch of ways we could do this. We could say that, well, in fact, we now re-look at science from a colonial history, so that the reason we understand science now to be telling us that existence is entangled is because of the rise of indigenous knowledges of non-Western approaches to non-nature, that is, the non-relevance of this kind of nature. Okay, so that's, I mean, there are other ways, but I think that's the most robust way we could do it. But now let me look at these four in another way. That is, not simply just saying, wait, how do you say axiom 1 and axiom 4 at the same time? But rather to say, how are we moving across these axioms? Are they just all relative? We can say 1, 2, 3, 4 in any order, and it doesn't matter. And I'd suggest that for most people now in critical theory, there's a way in which we begin in axiom 1, i.e. we say existence is entangled. And there's a claim that there's some kind of political content to that claim, right? Well, I would suggest there's no political content to the claim that existence is entangled. It's just existence is entangled. The only political content of that comes from, we could say, axiom 2. That is, the only reason we care that existence is entangled because we find that people have differential powers to affect the way in which they're situated in that entanglement. And the only reason we care about that is because we've found that that effort to change entanglement is compromised by the kinds of eventfulnesses that are distributed there. And the only reason we think any of this has to do with not the history of the biosphere, not the fact of the biosphere, but the fact of the colonial sphere. The fact that the way in which entanglement is entangled has to do with, 500-600 years of European excursions in the colonial world. And when we think in this way, then one of the questions goes, well, if it's the colonial sphere, and the colonial sphere is where we start, that is, we start there, then can we simply go back to science and the epistemologies and ontologies of the West, physics, et cetera, in a way in which they in some ways have changed. Now they tell us they also agree that existence is entangled. They also agree with that. But they also seem to be, at least in our discourse, seem to be repeating certain kinds of Western ontologies. And here, one of them would be biosphere. That is, the reading of an animist epistemology in which the claim is that everything is just like a human, right? Everything is bios or zoe, right? We can hop over bios and go, it starts with life. But in fact, what would happen if we said, which at least people I work with say, that when you say, yes, animals are like us, the presupposition there is we are like animals. And not only are animals like us, i.e. we are like animals, but rocks are not like us, mud is not like us, we are like mud. That is, you don't see the extension, which is always the humanist, Western humanist, oh, sorry, we didn't think you were human in the colonial sphere. We didn't grant you humanism. Now we understand you to be human, just like us, i.e., we extend ourselves in a gracious way as a means of keeping ourselves in place and making you mimic us. And I think what happens if you start with axiom 4, then you start asking yourself, do we want a biosphere? Do we want the biosphere in which a Western understanding of life as separated out, special, essential, the only thing we care about, and different from the inert, or not non-life as in death, but non-life as in geos and mud? Or do we want to allow, at least as a first gesture, to say, maybe we're nothing but stones? What would happen if we didn't start again and again by smuggling in a certain kind of ontology that I think is embedded in those sciences. I think one of the final things we would do if we started with the colonial sphere rather than the biosphere is that we'd rethink the question we ask of indigenous men and women and places. That is, when we ask, what's indigenous knowledge, right? And how do we redeploy it? Because I fear sometimes, and with my colleagues, fear that what we're seeing is a new kind of extraction. Not perhaps the extraction that led to the seventh continent, right? But a new onto-extraction, a new extraction of ontology, which, first you have to have, then we're going to extract it from you. And the use of that ontology to save the planet, right? To save everything. And here, it's weird. It's like, well, what do indigenous people know? Well, one thing they know is that the catastrophe, as Ursula said, is not happening now, and it's not happening in the future. It happened. It happened to them a long time ago. The catastrophe is not a venir, it's not coming, it's ancestral, it's historical. And thus the question is not what one knew before that, right? Not to force some people to be in a frozen past or to say your value to us is how your ontology can save the world or us, but rather indigenous knowledge is knowledge about how you keep persisting in no matter what. It is, in fact, what Gerald Visner, the Ashkenazi writer, called indigenous survivance.